The woman you just saw in the clip is a great friend of Vietnam and living history for the United States and the world. She has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize multiple times for her tireless activism, including efforts to end the Vietnam War, abolish nuclear weapons, and rid South Africa of apartheid. Her name is Cora Weiss. Since the 1950s, she has long been on the front line of the international women's and peace movements. During her lifetime of a committed for peace, she holds a special place for Vietnam in her heart. Today, we are very honored to have her on Talk Vietnam for the very first time. This special episode is filmed in New York, and I'm lucky enough to have Cora Weiss right next to me.
I'm luckier
Thank you so
to
much
have you.
for joining us.
You're very welcome. You're welcome to New York and welcome to our home.
So Cora, you are a fighter for peace, a pursuer of peace, and a conductor of peace. You did it all. So how did it all begin?
Well, first of all, you have to have a husband who never says no.
And we have him right here in the audience, our
Yeah.
special audience.
Yeah. And then you've got children, and you don't want them to grow up in countries that make war. And that includes your children and everybody's children. So that's very strong motivation to keep going. One day, on one of my birthdays, our son said something very funny. He said, we used to have to wait for my mom to come home from Vietnam to get a ride home from school. So, you know, they're laughing about it now. And you just do it.
So your work started in the 1950s, and by the 1960s, you had more than a decade of frontline organizational experience with peace and justice movements. So how did all of that experience help prepare you with your later work with Vietnam?
Well, every day that you're organizing, you learn something new. And if you participate in activism, you become an activist. And that's what happened. So I used to drive the kids to school and then go to Women Strike for Peace, was the most wonderful organization of women organized initially to prevent the further testing of atomic bombs. And Women Strike for Peace became my home and my teacher and my inspiration to keep going. And after the women's movement started, the anti-war movement started, because we said, not our sons and not your sons.
In 1969, the year that Richard Nixon's presidency began, the United States continued to be bogged down in the war in Vietnam. Although previously promising to take action to end the war during the election campaign, President Nixon's administration had no intention of keeping that promise. This caused the anti-war movement to continue to explode throughout the United States. For anti-war activists and the peace-loving American people, the Vietnamization strategy proposed by the Nixon administration only aimed to create a way out for the U.S. military and could not lead to a true peace for the Vietnamese people. The National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, or MO, of which Cora Weiss was one of the main executive members, was very active during this period. Together with another organization, the Vietnam Moratorium Committee and the Student Mobilization Committee, or SMC, they organized two largest protests and marches ever in American history in October and November 1969.
Cora knew that violence was not the way to work for peace. So she wanted to ensure that there was no violence at these events and they would be held in such a way. And her criteria was, I want this safe enough that I can bring my children to the events with me. I think that's one of the big things that helped the numbers. But it certainly set an environment but they understood that they were going to be peaceful protests. And Cora had a key role in making that happen.
With these protests, Cora Weiss and her colleagues continue to show their determination to act for peace and justice, and also convey that determination to millions of people across America.
You were a key leader in planning and organization of the mobilization, or MOB as it was called in shortened form, in November of 1969. So tell us more about this campaign.
First, I have to tell you that these were gendered times. I was the only woman co-chair of 4 or 5 men. We had no idea what the impact of our demonstrations were. We just did them because it was the right thing to do. And that was a famous one because both a Republican senator and a Democratic senator joined together with Coretta Scott King, Dr. Martin Luther King's wife, widow. It was the closest thing you could get to bipartisanship.
Right.
And we went to Vietnam with a proposal. And the proposal was written by a group of us from the anti-war movement, because at that time, the president was vowing to continue the bombing of North Vietnam as long as, quote, the Vietnamese were torturing our prisoners. And our position was, if we weren't bombing, they wouldn't shoot down the planes and there wouldn't be prisoners of war. They didn't know who was in the prison camp. They had no idea. And they were making up all kinds of stories about torture. And we didn't know who was there, really, because there was no list. So we made an offer to the Women's Union of Vietnam, because you don't negotiate with the government in a war. Otherwise, you go to jail for a long time when you come back.
Right.
It was called the Logan Act.
Okay.
So we did everything through the Women's Union. And the proposal was that if we hand-carried letters addressed to the prisoners of war from their families, A, would they accept them and hand them out? And B, would they let the prisoners write a letter in return, which we would carry back by hand, so it wouldn't be interrupted for censorship, which is what had been happening until then. And it would be picked out by the intelligence agencies. So if you take them by hand, nobody can pick them out, nobody can censor them. And that was true for the mail coming back also. And the Vietnamese accepted our offer. And we brought home 300 letters, which created the first list of pilots. They're mostly pilots, but of prisoners of war. And that was kind of the first time that ever happened in wartime. It's an initiative started by mere mortals like me. I was called a housekeeper from the Bronx.
How often did you and your teams deliver and receive the POW and family mail?
We would send 3 Americans every single month, which we did for 3 years. 1 month we couldn't. They claimed that there was bad weather and it wouldn't allow us to send them. So every month for 3 years, we sent 3 Americans. And they served 2 purposes. The first was to provide mail to the pilots, the prisoners of war, from their families with family news. And the second was to bring mail back from them if they wanted to write a letter every month to their families that were not censored. That was the first time the families had gotten, most of the families had gotten mail from them. And it established a list of names of who was alive in the Vietnam prison camp.
Can you explain to me a little bit more about the uniqueness of this mail exchange system? Did it happen in other war before or even now in the current context?
Well, I'm not sure that any war before had an exchange of mail run by civilians. And we also not only exchanged mail, but while I was in Vietnam, it occurred to me that maybe we should help the guys in the prison camps get more packages or more things than they were getting. And the Vietnamese really resisted that because they showed us pictures of sabotage material that was wrapped into the packages that they were getting from home so that they could make a radio, for instance, or Morse code system. But I said to them, well, what if they just were allowed to have books, not with hard covers, games, dice? What if you restricted what could be sent in the boxes? Would you increase them then? And they agreed. The sabotage stopped because we exposed it.
What were the larger impacts of facilitating the mail and packages?
We had to get rid of the pretext that the government was using to perpetuate the war. And they had created the idea that as long as American soldiers, pilots, were being tortured in prison camps, they would continue to bomb the North. Every month we wrote down the number that we took of letters and the number we brought back. And we kept it on a big chart. It was important because it helped to deflect the pretext that we needed to get rid of for continuing a war based on the prisoner of war issue.
How the American administration positioned the POW issue?
Some of the politicians would go around giving lectures. Somebody put a cage in the Congress of the United States, in the building, that represented the cages that allegedly the prisoners were held in. Eventually, I guess we found out they were lies, that the men that were captured were tortured, and so therefore they were going to continue bombing. So it was used to perpetuate the war. And we had to get rid of that so that we could start ending the war.
Right. The facilitation of that mail exchange system, did you face any challenges? Because I think it was a lot of work and you sustained it for 3 consecutive years.
Yeah, but you had to do it. So we did it.
How did you do it?
Well, people used to call us and say, can I go? Or we would call them and say, will you go? Somebody, Noam Chomsky, who's fairly famous, well known, told me once that he remembers I called him at midnight and told him to pack his bag. So people have stories about how they went.
Right.
But the point is that when they came back, they not only brought mail, which was very important, but they were eyewitness reporters on what was going on in Vietnam, in North Vietnam, not South Vietnam. It was before reunification.
Right.
And they told people, they used to go around and talk, and it enabled us to become witnesses, eyewitnesses to a war.
Right. And in September of 1972, you not only managed the mail deliveries, but you also received 3 POWs released from prison to the Women's Union and turned over to the Committee of Liaison for the return trip to the United States. What were some key memories from that historic trip?
First, it was August. I was on vacation with Peter and our 3 children, and we got a phone call saying, come to Paris. That was the Committee of Liaison that I was the co-director of with David Dillinger. So David and I, the next day, after I found somebody to stay with our kids and Peter, we flew to Paris, and they were talking about the idea of releasing 3 pilots. And it was very exciting, and it had happened once or twice before, but never in such a large way. And as we were walking to the airplane in the airport, they said, "Oh, by the way, you can bring a family member." Well, we nearly fell apart. I mean, that's never happened before. Here's a book about it here.
Okay.
This woman is a very well-known wife, mother of Mark Gartley, and she moved from being a supporter of the war initially to becoming a very staunch anti-war activist. She used to speak at our anti-war demonstrations. Her name was Minnie Lee Gartley. And we came back, and it's headline news. Hanoi frees 3 American PWs. That's the Daily News, which is one of the biggest newspapers. At that time, it certainly was. But it's the front page picture at the airport. But here's Minnie Lee, and here's Olga, and here's me. And we just landed.
Right.
And this is on the tarmac. And we're greeted by the Vietnamese 2 men.
And what was the purpose of those trips of meeting with POWs in Hanoi?
So we could have something to tell their families when we got back. But that wasn't the only reason we went. We also went to see Vietnam and to see what was happening. We had a lot of war experience those days that we were traveling across the country. We spent a lot of time in bomb shelters. But that was an experience for American POWs to experience their own planes fighting above their heads, and they could have bombed us.
Among the POWs you met in Hanoi, there was a naval aviator and commander, Captain Gene Wilbur, who had been captured in Vietnam in 1968. Could you recall the memory you had with Gene?
Of course we met Gene Wilbur. He was terrific. Gene Wilbur changed his mind about war during wartime. A few other people did too, but his were broadcast. He was a unique prisoner of war.
In what way?
He opposed the war, and he went on the radio to say so.
Yeah.
That took guts, courage, because he could have been clobbered by his fellow prisoners who were very staunchly pro-war. I guess he was vilified in the press or by other people when he got back. But so was I. And you just do it, you take it, because you know you did the right thing.
Gene Wilbur was vilified and went through a lot because of his anti-war statement. And then his son, Tom Wilbur, I think you know him very well.
He's incredible. He's a fantastic American.
Right. So he recalled that when his father returned from the war, the whole family was invited to your home and had dinner with you.
The dinner table is the best table. You talk, you meet, you get to know each other.
Tom Wilbur, son of former prisoner of war Eugene Wilbur, has walked the street of New York dozens of times. Today, he's visiting a treasured friend who he met for the first time 51 years ago at the age of 17.
Hello? Hello!
Cora. Great to see
How
you.
nice to see you!
It's been a while. How are you? Great to see you. I'm excited to show you something I found recently.
What'd you see? What'd you find?
Well, a letter
Oh my
that
God.
you typed and signed here. So, yes, I was so excited when I found this because it was postmarked on the envelope, and you typed this the Monday morning after we had dinner at your home. Because you're saying, especially to Dad here, I must say it was a lot better seeing you at home than in Hanoi. And we were all very impressed at how well you looked. It certainly showed on your beaming family who sparkled.
Oh, how nice.
And it sounds like Cora Weiss saying
It
this.
was.
And it was. Other detail that supports a lot of the documentation stuff I've uncovered over the years is you provided in this letter the dates and the letters from my dad that you picked up and sent back. Thanks from then and thank you now. She invited us to her home in New York and made a wonderful dinner for our entire family and her family. And we had dinner together and talked and had a wonderful evening. Just a wonderful representation of her care, her true care and concern for prisoners of war.
Captain Wilbur, we've heard so many awful tales of torture of our POWs. What was your experience?
Well, I was not tortured.
Let us, if I may, play back to you what Americans heard Walter Wilbur say. It was broadcast by Radio Moscow from Radio Hanoi.
Captain Wilbur has a message to Americans who oppose the war.
The recent unification of the many anti-Vietnam war groups, along with millions of peace-loving citizens, for an early end to the Vietnam War, brought floods of joy into my heart.
That is your voice.
Yes, that's my voice.
What were the circumstances under which you made that, Captain Wilbur?
It was made voluntarily. I think
Because of the word voluntarily, Eugene Wilbur was vilified. After Eugene Wilbur passed away in 2015, his son Tom Wilbur decided to find out what urged his father to speak against the war in Vietnam.
After my father died, and I had made these trips to Vietnam and was uncovering more research and kind of felt a little bit lost where to go, who to ask, I looked up Cora Weiss and called her. And she remembered who I was immediately and remembered my father and was so sorry to hear that he had passed away. But we had a lengthy phone call. And the result of that was visits to her home. And when she found out of my travels, her deep interest in that, and her then helping direct me to other resources and contacts in Vietnam. And through her, I met so many people in areas that I wouldn't have explored in Vietnam, which really expanded my network.
To Cora and Walter Eugene Wilbur, the day the Paris Peace Accord was signed meant so much for them because it was the day that signified the beginning of the peace process in Vietnam. After the Paris Peace Accord was signed,
Yeah.
yes, how did you feel?
Well, I felt like many, like the majority of Americans, because the majority of the Americans turned out to be anti-war. Kissinger and Nixon couldn't drop a bomb, an atom bomb on Vietnam because of public opinion. So that matters a lot.
We have a very beautiful photo of you and Madame Bing.
Nguyen Thi Binh was a role model for women. She is an extraordinary diplomat, an extraordinary leader, an extraordinary woman. And we liked each other a lot. She used to say that she'd been in Paris waiting for the peace talks for 7 generations of swans. She counted the time by the number of little swanlets that she could find, the babies that would come.
But then finally,
It happened.
it happened. Following the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, your peace and justice work with Vietnam continued. So tell us more about the programs you implemented in Vietnam. For example, some programs on health, and bring food supplies to the people of Vietnam.
Friend shipment was a play on words, friendship and shipment. And we organized doctors and hospitals and ordinary citizens to gather medical supplies because the Bach Mai Hospital was bombed. And it was a very famous teaching hospital in Southeast Asia. That was our first place to help restore the hospital. And then I worked with Church World Service. The mission was to bring a ship of wheat to South Vietnam. This is when the war is over. And it was the first ship to go from the United States to Vietnam after the war.
How many tons of wheat?
10,000 tons of wheat.
Wow.
It was huge. They unloaded the wheat, and about 5 hours later, they brought us bread that they had already made from the grains of wheat. So that was quite moving.
On January 27, 1973, the Paris Agreement on Ending the War and Restoring Peace in Vietnam was officially signed. For the Vietnamese people, this is an important milestone, setting the stage for the path to final victory. However, from here, Vietnam entered a difficult journey in reviving its economy, which had been severely damaged after years of war. With her mission of ending the war almost completed, Cora Weiss decided to turn to people-to-people support activities to accompany the Vietnamese people in rebuilding the country. She and her colleagues quickly established the Bach Mai Hospital Fund to help rebuild hospitals and medical facilities that were heavily damaged after the December 1972 U.S. bombing in Hanoi. This was also part of Friendshipment, a coalition of 36 political and social organizations working together to help Vietnam in many aspects.
She was very instrumental all through the war in communication with the Vietnamese people and the government, and opened up a lot of avenues of communications, and that was very important.
10,000 tons of wheat, donated by thousands of farmers in Texas, came from Houston and crossed the ocean to Vietnam on a ship called Antioquia, which was a precious gift from her and her colleagues at Church World Service. This amount of wheat, which was worth more than $2 million at the time, greatly helped the Vietnamese people overcome food shortages and improve their lives. These practical actions showed that Cora Weiss's determination for peace and justice did not just stop at ending the war, but she really wants to bring a better life to the people in a country she has accompanied for all these years.
After 1975, when Vietnam reunified, you continued working to assist the country in many aspects for the Vietnamese delegation to the UN in New York. The moment you introduced the Vietnamese flag to be raised in the UN was so emotional. So can you recall this moment?
The world was ready to get Vietnam at the UN because they weren't party to the war. First France and then the US. I think the rest of the world was ready to bring Vietnam to the table.
Right. But you were the one that witnessed that special moment and be a part of it.
I'm not alone. You have to understand that the movement was huge, and I'm one of the movement makers.
Right.
Even after the war ended.
Yes.
We had Friendshipment. We had visits. Peter and I, my husband and I think we're the first foreigners or first Americans, certainly, to go from the north of North Vietnam to the south of South Vietnam after reunification. It was a remarkable trip.
Thanks to your global diplomacy, your documentary titled Picking Up Pieces, featuring Vietnam's post-war reconstruction efforts, was made possible by the Downtown Community Television Center, or DCTV, in 1978. And I believe this documentary made headlines at that time because it was the first time an American television crew was allowed back into Vietnam after the U.S. Withdrawal to portray an up-close study of Vietnam's grim post-war reality.
Oh, it's the most beautiful, wonderful, moving movie. It's by two wonderful, beautiful people, Keiko Tsuno, Japanese American, and John Alpert, a Jewish American. And they're married. And they said to me one day, we want to go to Vietnam and shoot footage. So I helped them get in. They were the first filmmakers to go to Vietnam after the war. And they shot a beautiful film about Vietnam after the war, picking up the pieces.
Yeah.
And it showed the degree of damage and tragedy, but it also showed the hope.
I watched it, and it's a beautiful documentary.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I cried.
Yeah, I cried too. We're gonna visit them soon.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Cora Weiss took us to DCTV, a leading documentary production and film education center in New York City, to meet with John Alpert and Keiko Tsuno. Alpert and Tsuno made headlines with the 1977 journalistic coup when they became the first American television crew allowed back into Vietnam after the war and were given unprecedented access to the ruined countryside and its people. The resulting up-close study of Vietnam's grim post-war reality relies on the voices of the common people to tell their stories. This history-making documentary shows the resilience of the Vietnamese people and how they were able to set things aside and build their lives after such a devastating period of war.
Cora told the members of the Vietnam mission to the United Nations that they could trust us. And so she recommended, but they wanted to see for themselves. So Cora arranged for two members of the Vietnam delegation to the UN to come visit us in our small loft. We were around the corner in a little tiny space that we lived and worked in, right on the edge of Chinatown. And at this particular point, we had only made 2 documentaries. Very young, very, very spirited, very idealistic. So it never would have started without Cora.
She had a faith in us. And she really sort of showed us, the future. It's always she was behind of us, which was a strength, a strong strength, pushed our own will.
The documentary has been screened many times to the public, and each time it always succeeded in spreading the message of putting an end to war and maintaining peace in all circumstances.
Và cũng mong rằng qua cái cuộc trình chiếu này thì công chúng Mỹ cũng sẽ hiểu rõ hơn quan hệ Việt-Mỹ, lịch sử quan hệ giữa hai nước, cũng như là thôi thúc công chúng Mỹ cũng như là người dân Mỹ đóng góp vào việc thúc đẩy quan hệ Việt-Mỹ phát triển trong thời gian tới.
The U.S. and Vietnam have seen major improvements in the diplomatic relations between the two countries 50 years after the war. And the two countries now established a comprehensive strategic partnership. You witnessed it all. What can you say about the future of the Vietnam-U.S. relation?
Well, first of all, the U.S. and Vietnam, which once were at war, big time, a war that left permanent damage. Agent Orange is still killing not just the Vietnamese, more of them, but American soldiers who were fighting in the area where Agent Orange was sprayed. So they've gone from that antagonism and hatred and everything that goes with war, terrible, to favored nation status of trade. Vietnam and the United States are favorite trade partners. So I now have this lovely yellow t-shirt, and it says, Made in Vietnam, right in the back.
So we have more and more Vietnamese products available in the U.S.
So there's an active relationship.
Something
On my
like that.
last trip to Vietnam, I went to the airport with my Vietnamese friends, and I said to them, call me when the war is over. And they said to me, when the first Vietnamese restaurant opens in New York, you'll know the war is over. Mm-hmm. And they were right.
And now there are so many Vietnamese
Yeah.
restaurants. Yes. So after all, Cora, what does Vietnam mean to you?
The Vietnamese are extraordinary people. I mean, they have survived the most horrific napalm, Agent Orange. The Vietnamese people have become our friends. Teenagers love going on bicycle trips to Vietnam. It's great for biking. Mm-hmm. And it's a big tourism business, too. It's a beautiful, beautiful country. Mm-hmm. But it's been how many years since the war? 1973? Mm-hmm.
So more than 50 years.
Exactly. Your math is good.
If you have something to say to the Vietnamese audience who would be watching our program, what would you say to them?
Thank you.
Just that?
Yeah. Thank you for being our friends.
Thank you for your work to promote peace, all of your wisdom. Thank you so much for sharing it to us today, and I hope that our viewers out there would be inspired.
Thank you for doing what you're doing.
Cora Weiss, a significant leader of the anti-Vietnam War movement, is already at her 90, but she is still very active and working tirelessly, giving her voice to shed more light on things that needed to be correctly understood in the present, mistakes to be learned from the past, and wise advice for future generations. A lifetime fighting for peace, a lifetime of service. That is the legacy of Cora Weiss. But how did it all begin? I leave you with Cora Weiss' words. Nothing happens unless first a dream. Cora Weiss, thank you so much for your insights, for your wisdom, and for your continuous efforts for peace.
Thank you, but I'm not 90 yet. I'll be 89 next week.
Okay, but by the time we air this, you would be 90.
Oh, mon Dieu! It takes so long.
And that brings us to the end of our episode here in New York. Thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.
Most of the people in the anti-war movement that I came really to respect because of what they did were the people that made the effort to go to Vietnam and see for themselves what it was like. And she was one of those people. And she not only did that, but she got so many other people to go.
As over the years, as former pre-OWs were having maybe difficulty in job transitions, she was helping people get started in business or get counseling or do things.
Cora has been my inspiration throughout my life. She's just one of the most amazing human being.
Cora Weiss was in the center of anti-war activities, but more than that, pro-peace activities and pro-relationships between American people and Vietnamese people. She was the #1 person in the United States.
Thanks from then, and thank you now.